Welcome back to the Obby series. In today's episode, we're going to be implementing the skip system, which allows players to skip the stage that they're currently stuck at and teleport directly to the next one. This involves us creating a GUI and scripting the system on both the server and the client. So we have a pretty eventful video lined up for today. So hopping directly into Studio, the first thing that we're going to do is actually create the button for opening up the skips GUI that we're also going to create in just a little bit. Now, this open button is actually going to appear towards the top of our screen beside our progress bar. So since we don't technically have to create the entire GUI, that actually saves us some time. Anyways, in order to get started with this, we're going to go inside of the starter GUI, inside of the top GUI, and then inside of this frame. Inside of this frame, we already have a canvas group called stage, which is the actual stage progress bar that we created previously. So what we're going to do is inside of this frame, we're going to go ahead and create a brand new text button. I'm going to go ahead and rename this text button to be called skip. And then I'm going to update the background color of this to be the exact same blue that we use for our buttons over here. Then I'm going to set the text of this text button to be blank because we don't actually want to use the text inside of here. Next, what I want to do is go ahead and resize this. So on the x-axis, we're going to set the offset of that to 100. And on the y, we can leave the offset at 50. Next, if we actually take a look inside of our stage canvas group, we can see that we already have a UI stroke and a UI corner created for us. So what I'm going to do is highlight both of these. If you're unsure of how to highlight multiple things inside of Studio, you can hold down the control button and then click whatever things that you want to select or deselect. Then I'm going to copy these by hitting Control C. And then I'm going to paste them both directly inside of the skip text button by highlighting the text button and then hitting Control, Shift, and V. And now we have both of those pasted inside of here. Now, let's go ahead and first update the UI stroke. Instead of setting the apply stroke mode to contextual, we actually want to go with border because remember, this is a text button. And we want the stroke to appear around the button instead of the text. And our UI corner has a corner radius of 15, which I'm actually perfectly fine with, so those are the only adjustments that we're going to make to both of those. Next, what we're going to do is throw a text label inside of here, but because we've already created some UIs before, so to save us some time and avoid setting all of the same properties that we normally do, we're going to go inside of the staged canvas group, and we're just going to go ahead and take this amount text label from inside of here, so we're going to go ahead and copy that and paste it directly inside of the skip text button. Then, let's go ahead and rename this text label to be called title. And we'll also set the text of this to actually say skip. Then I want to adjust the text size a tiny bit because we just want to make this a little bit smaller. So we're going to go from 34 down to 30. And because of that, we also might want to adjust the UI stroke size a tiny bit as well, or actually the thickness. And I think I want to decrease this from 5 to maybe about 3. And now I think the button is looking pretty good, but we're actually going to add one more thing to this. The last thing that we want to add to this button is actually going to be a little red circle with an exclamation mark inside of it. And you can kind of think of it as an alert or a notification, which will indicate to the player that they should click on that button. So we're going to make this little red circle appear whenever the player has earned another skip. So again, we'll kind of use that button to notify the player that they have received one and that they should click that button to be able to actually use it. So inside of the skip button, we're going to go ahead and add in a brand new frame to this. We'll go ahead and rename this frame to be called notification. And then we're going to go ahead and resize it and make it a lot smaller. Rather than it being 100 by 100, let's go ahead and make it 30 by 30. And now we can see we have a much smaller square. Then let's go ahead and update the background color of this. I'm going to go with a nice little red just like that. And then inside of here, we're going to want to go ahead and add in a UI corner. Now, because we want this to be an entire circle, all we actually have to do is set the corner radius on the scale to 1. And that'll fully round the corners, making this into a complete circle. Then we're also going to want to add a UI stroke to this, so I'm just going to duplicate the UI stroke that we already have inside of the button and bring that inside of here. We're probably going to want to decrease the thickness of the stroke a little bit, so I'm again going to go from 5 down to 3. And I think that's looking pretty good. And now the last thing that we want to do is add that exclamation mark inside of this notification frame as well. So let's go ahead and duplicate the title text label, drag it inside of the notification frame. We'll set the text of this text label to just be an exclamation mark. And we'll probably also want to decrease the text size a little bit. So we'll actually go from 30 down to 24. And now if we take a look at that, that is looking pretty good. The last thing that we have to do with this notification frame is actually reposition it. And now where do we want this to appear? Well, we actually want this to appear at the top right-hand corner of the text button. Now, I believe it was in the last episode where I actually went over how we can perfectly position a button at the top right-hand corner of a frame. But I was actually just taught an even simpler method by one of the members on my debug team. So big shout out to Bobby for teaching me this. It's a very simple method and it does not involve any math at all. And if you're confused by what I'm referring to, previously what we would do is we would take the size of the button and then we would divide that in half in order to position this perfectly. But instead of doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to adjust the position property, and on the X scale, we're going to set that to 1. Now this notification frame appears towards the very far right of the skip button. And looking at the notification frame, we want to pull this a little bit away from how far it is towards the right side. And then we also want to bring it up just a tiny bit as well. And to easily do this, all we actually have to do is set the anchor point to 0.5 on both the X and the Y axis, and now we can see that the notification frame is positioned perfectly at the top right-hand corner of our button. How easy was that? Okay, and now with all that being said, we're actually fully finished with creating the skip button, but now what we need to do is reposition this button so that it appears on the right-hand side of the stage canvas group and it looks nice. There's a couple of different ways that we can handle this, but what I'm going to do is use a UI list layout to make this as easy and simple as possible. So now, with the UI list layout, what we're going to want to do is we're first going to want to update the fill direction from vertical to horizontal because we want all the things laid out inside of this frame horizontally. Then we can go down to the alignment and we want to change the horizontal alignment from left to center. And then we also want to change the vertical alignment from top down to center as well. And now we can go ahead and adjust the padding, and I want about 20 pixels of space in between the skip button and the stage canvas group. And I think that's actually looking pretty good. Now, because of how we have this set up, this kind of forces our stage progress bar to not really be centered on our screen. And in the future, we're going to have an additional button, which is going to look exactly like skip, but the button's going to appear on the left side, and it's actually going to be the mode button, which a player can click on to enable or disable the easy mode in our obby. So because it should take us less than a minute, and it'll prevent the stage canvas group from being uncentered, let's just go ahead and do that right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and duplicate the skip button. Then we'll rename this to be called mode. We'll go inside of here and we'll go ahead and adjust the text label. So instead of the text saying skip, we'll go ahead and say mode. And then we'll also go ahead and delete the notification frame from inside of here as well. And that's all the changes that we even have to make to the mode button. But now we can see that these are all kind of being displayed out of order. And if we look at the UI list layout, by default, the sort order is set to layout order. So what that means is we can go ahead and adjust the layout order of these in a specific way to have them laid out how we want them to be. So I want skip to be displayed on the right, which is going to be last. So this should be the highest number. I'm going to go ahead and set the number of this to 3. Now we can see that skip is appearing all the way towards the right. Then for stage, I want this to appear in the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to 2. And now we can see that mode is automatically appearing all the way towards the left because this is the lowest number. So this would appear first. It's perfectly fine if we leave this at 0, but just to stay consistent, I'm going to go ahead and set this to 1. So now our layout order is 1 for mode, 2 for stage, and 3 for skip, so that they're all laid out exactly how we want them to be. And with that being said, we're fully finished with creating the skip button and the mode button, so we can go ahead and collapse the top screen GUI because we're all done inside of there. Now, that doesn't mean that we're fully finished with creating our GUIs because we still have to create the entire skips GUI. So, to begin creating the skips GUI, let's save ourselves some time by duplicating the settings screen GUI. So we're going to go ahead and select the settings screen GUI, then we'll hit Ctrl D to duplicate it, and now we'll go ahead and rename one of these to be called skips. Then let's go ahead and enable it so that we can actually see it, and now let's go inside of it and begin customizing it. So the first thing that we're going to do is make a change to the frame. We want to resize this a little bit, so for the size, we want to make this a little bit larger horizontally, so rather than going with 600, we're actually going to go with 650. And then on the y-axis, we're going to make this a little bit smaller, so we're going to go with 400. So now let's go inside of the frame and sort of start from top to bottom. So first, we would start with the exit button, but this is actually perfectly fine. We're going to maintain the size and the position, so we're happy with that. Then we have the title frame, which we're actually perfectly fine with the sizing and the positioning of this, but we actually want to modify the title text label that's inside of there. So rather than our text saying settings, we of course want this to actually say skips. And now the title is perfectly fine. Next, we have the container, which we actually are not going to use at all, so we can go ahead and remove that. Now, the first thing that we want to do inside of here is create a brand new text label, which we're going to go ahead and call description, and it's basically going to describe to the player what this GUI does, and effectively how they obtain skips. And now, to save some time, we're going to go inside of the title frame and we're going to go ahead and duplicate the title text label. So let's go ahead and duplicate that and drag it into the frame itself. Then we'll go ahead and rename this text label to be called description. And for the text of this, we're going to say skip ahead to the next obstacle, and then we'll end that with an exclamation mark. And then after that, we'll say earn a free skip every 2 minutes. Just like that. And now, obviously, we have to resize this a little bit. First, let's go ahead and adjust the text size of this, and we need to make this a lot smaller. So we're going to go all the way from 60 down to 34. After that, we're actually going to go ahead and adjust the sizing of this, and instead of using scale, we'll go ahead and use offset. So on the x-axis, we're going to go with 550, and on the y-axis, we're going to go with 75. Then, in addition to that, we also want to make sure that we have text wrapped enabled so that the text actually wraps once it reaches the end of the horizontal size. Then, of course, we can go ahead and drag this around a little bit and actually reposition it. Now, of course, we're going to want to center this horizontally, so let's go ahead and set the X of the anchor point to 0.5 and the X of the position scale to 0.5 as well. And for the Y, we're going to go ahead and use offset here, and we want to actually set this at 125. And now we're finished with actually creating the description. The next thing that we're going to want to do is create the progress bar. Again, to save us some time, we're actually going to take the progress bar from the top GUI. So inside of the top GUI, inside of the frame, we have the stage canvas group right here. Let's go ahead and copy this and paste this directly inside of the frame. Then we can collapse the top GUI because we're no longer going to be needing that open. And now let's begin by adjusting the size of this. We want this to be a little bit larger on the X-axis, so we're going to set this to 550. And for the Y, we don't want to use any scale here. We'd rather use offset. And we want to make this 50 pixels tall, so we're going to set that to 50, just like that. Then, of course, let's go ahead and reposition this. It's already centered horizontally. Let's also center this vertically as well, so we'll go ahead and set the Y of the anchor point to 0.5 and the Y of the position scale to 0.5 as well. Then we'll go ahead and add some offset to the Y-axis so that we can bring this down a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and add about 65 pixels to it. And now I think that looks pretty nice. Let's go ahead and rename this canvas group from being called stage to being called progress bar. And then we can take a look inside of here. For the amount text label, let's go ahead and modify this a little bit. Rather than displaying the stage that the player is on, we're actually going to display a time in minutes and seconds for how long the player has left before they'll receive their next free skip. So I'm going to set the text of this to 01:59. Which effectively is telling the player that they need to wait 1 minute and 59 seconds before they receive their next skip. Now, another thing that I want to do is actually tune down the UI stroke inside of the amount text label a little bit. So we're going to change this from 5 to 3. And now I think that's looking pretty good. But one of the last things that I want to do is actually set the progress to 0.5 on the X scale so that we can see what that looks like when it's about halfway completed. And now I would say that we're good with the progress bar, so we can go ahead and collapse that as well. The last thing that we need to do inside of here is create the use button for players to actually redeem their skip. So let's go ahead and duplicate the exit button. We'll rename this to be called use. Then let's go ahead and resize this a little bit. So on the X-axis, we're going to set that to 300. And on the Y, we're going to go ahead and set that to 50. Then let's reposition it. Of course, we're going to want to center this horizontally. So let's go ahead and set that to 0.5 on the X-axis. And then on the X offset, we want to set that to 0 instead of 32. Next, we want this to appear pretty far down towards the bottom. So for the Y of the anchor point, we're going to set that to 1. And then for the Y scale of the position, we're going to set that to 1 as well. And now actually, because we duplicated the exit button, our Y offset is set to -32. So that position is actually pretty good. Although what I was originally going to go with is -20 on the Y offset, and I still kind of prefer that, but you can go ahead and use whatever spacing you prefer. Next, I'm going to go ahead and update the background color of this, and I'm actually wanting to use the exact same green that we used inside of the progress bar. Then we'll go inside of the use button, and let's update the text label called X to be called title. Then for the text of this, I'm going to say something like use, and then in parentheses, I'm going to say 999, and then a closing parenthesis, as this is how we'll actually display the amount of skips that the player currently has. Now I want to bring the size of this text down a little bit, so we're going to go down from 38 to 34. I also want to decrease the stroke a tiny bit, so for the UI stroke inside of the title, let's go from 5 down to 3. And I also want to change the line join mode from round to miter, because that's always my preferred line join mode when using UI strokes on text. Then let's go back to the use button, and I want to go ahead and adjust the UI corner. I want to make those corners a little bit less round, so rather than going with 18, we're actually going to go with 6. And then I also want to decrease the UI stroke thickness of the use button as well, so we're going to go down from 5 to 3. And now I think our use button is looking pretty good. Oh, I actually just realized that there's one more thing that I want to do. It's a very small detail, so you don't have to do it if you don't want to, but for the progress bar, I want to make those corners a little bit more round. So I'm going to go from about 15 over to say 22 or maybe even 23, and now I think that looks perfect. So with that being said, we're done with creating this GUI. We can go ahead and collapse all of those, and the starter's GUI itself as well. Well, actually, we might want to set the enabled property of the skips GUI to false so that we don't see it, but you might want to do that at the end once you fully scripted it out. Either way, it doesn't really matter. So to begin scripting, the first thing that we want to do is go ahead and update the player data. Of course, the reason that we're going to be doing this is because the player is going to earn skips while they play the game, or they can even use Robux to purchase them as developer products. So of course, we're going to want to save that to their account so that whenever they rejoin the game, they still retain the amount of skips that they had previously. So let's go ahead and add this to the player data. To do that, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage and open up the player data module script. Inside of here, first we're going to go ahead and add this to the player data type. So below where we added the settings, let's go ahead and create a brand new table, which is going to be called skips. And we're going to set the type of this to actually a table. And this is going to be a dictionary. So inside of here, we're going to store two different key value pairs. The first key that we're going to set is going to be called amount, and that is going to be a number. Now, of course, this key value pair is going to be for the amount of skips that the player has in total. Then we're going to add a second key value pair, which this key is going to be called next, and the value of it is going to be a number. And now what we're referring to by next is when the player will receive their next skip. So basically, we're going to set the value of next to a number, which is a Unix timestamp in the future for when the player can receive their next skip. Don't worry, that might sound confusing to you, but as we go through this, it'll be much easier to understand. Anyways, now that we've updated the player data type, let's go ahead and actually update our default player data variable. So below settings, we're going to go ahead and add in the skips table. We're going to set that equal to a table. And now for amount, we're going to go ahead and start out all of our players with 0 skips. But of course, if you want to start them out with 1 or more, you can feel free to do that as well. Then for next, we're going to set this to 0 as well, just to kind of set it as a default number. And now with that being said, that's actually all that we're going to do inside of this script, and that's all that we needed to do to add that data to our player data. So we can go ahead and close out of that module script. And now since we're still inside of the replicated storage, the next thing that I want to do is actually update how we handle the state for this specific data. So we're going to go inside of the functions folder and open up the update state module script. Now the first thing that I want to do inside of here is actually add the brand new state actions. So I'm going to use a pipe symbol, then I'm going to hit enter, and now I'm going to go ahead and create our brand new table. So for the type of this action, we're going to go ahead and call this earn skip. Then we'll use a comma, and for our second key, we're going to go ahead and call this amount, which is going to be a number, and this is actually going to be optional. So I'm going to add a question mark onto the end of this. The reason for that is because we don't always have to include an amount when we use this. If we don't include an amount, then we'll just assume that we're actually giving the player a single skip. But we want to be able to specify an amount just in case we want to reward the player more than one skip, which could possibly be from them purchasing the developer product or doing different things like that. So that's why we're giving ourselves the option and including amount here. Now I know that the formatting is broke, but I'll fix that after we add in our second action. So I'm going to use another vertical bar symbol. Then I'll go ahead and create our table. And now for our second action, we're going to go ahead and call this use skip. And now our use skip action is not actually going to have any other arguments or information, whatever you want to specifically call them. This is going to be a very simple action, and all we need to pass through is actually the type of it. So now that we've created both of those, let's go ahead and reformat our code properly. So I'm going to highlight all that, hit tab, and now those are positioned pretty nicely. So now that we've added those two actions, let's go ahead and update the function here as well. So below where we implemented update settings, let's go ahead and use another else if statement. This time we'll say action.type equals, and we'll go ahead and set up earn skip first. Now remember, earn skip can have an amount key passed to it, but it doesn't always have to. So what we want to do is we want to say action.amount equals, and then we're going to say if action.amount then, and then we'll actually go ahead and use action.amount. Otherwise, we want to go ahead and use 1. So we do this to make sure that action.amount is actually set. And if it's not set, then we'll set it to 1, making sure that it is actually set. And now that we've done that, let's go ahead and actually update the player's data. So we're going to say player data dot skips dot amount plus equals action.amount. Now we may see a red underline underneath of action.amount, which is kind of very, very annoying. Roblox Studio is just so ugh. Like, I mean, come on, Roblox Studio, you should be smart enough to tell from this very simple if statement that action.amount is always set. We shouldn't have to do some black magic trickery to make Studio realize, oh my gosh, action.amount is actually set. It is such an annoying thing. If this really annoys you, then what you can say is if action.amount, and you should be able to throw this inside of here. And now that makes the error go away. But like also that just adds in a couple extra lines of code, which I don't want to do. So I guess I'm just going to have to live my life being annoyed by this red underline until, I don't know, maybe 2030 when Roblox Studio catches up to the standards of the entire industry and, figures out. Anyway, there's one more thing that we need to do with this specific action. So now that we've actually rewarded the player with a skip because they've earned it, what we also want to do is reset their timer for earning a skip. So the first thing we're going to do is actually create a variable inside of here, which is going to be a constant variable. We should probably create this variable outside, but in my opinion, it just makes sense and feels the best to actually create it inside of here. So this is going to be a constant, which is going to be called skips cooldown in seconds. So we're going to say skips underscore cooldown underscore seconds. And the value of this is how many seconds we want the player to wait before they earn another skip. And I'm going to say 120 so that the player has to wait 2 minutes before they earn a skip. And now the only reason that we're creating that variable is to make it very clear where we're actually using it. So now that we've done that, we can go ahead and actually update the player's data. So we're going to say player data dot skips dot next, and then what we're going to set this equal to is the current time. So os.time. Now, what os.time does is it returns how many seconds have passed since the Unix epoch. And if none of that makes sense to you, don't worry. Basically, we use os.time as a way of getting the current time in seconds since basically January 1st on 1970. This is pretty much the standard way that programmers are able to kind of interact with time, I guess. It's not the best description of it. I'll go ahead and leave a link down below in the description to this website right here called unixtimestamp.com. Because I think it'll make it a lot easier to understand exactly what Unix timestamps are, how to work with them, and even how to plan what a future timestamp might look like. But basically, we can see this number is ticking up because it displays the amount of seconds since January 1st, 1970. And then beneath it, we can see what the time actually is for me right now. So it is currently 6:45 with 53 seconds passed. And then we can also see the date here as well. So I'm recording this on April 1st, 2024. And when I first opened up this webpage, this was my exact time in, I guess, UTC. But this right here is actually the Unix timestamp or the number that is given to us when we use os.time. I mean, of course, this number is always changing, but what I'm trying to say is what is returned to us is an extremely long number that looks something like this. So the most important thing to understand from that is basically os.time will return to us the current time in seconds. So we want to use that number and then we want to add 120 seconds on top of it, which would then specify the exact time for when we'll receive our next skip. So now that we've gotten our current time, let's go ahead and add the skip's cooldown seconds variable to that number. And now we've just added 120 seconds to the current time to specify when the player will receive their next skip. And now with that being said, we're actually finished with implementing the earn skip action. So let's go ahead and use another else if here. And now we want to implement the use skip action. So we're going to say action.type equals use skip. And this is a very simple one. All we're going to do is actually subtract 1 from the player skips amount data. So we're going to say player data dot skips dot amount minus equals 1 to subtract 1 from the total amount of skips. And with all of that being done, we're fully finished with updating how we manage the state for this data, so we can go ahead and close out of this module script as well. And while we're still here inside of the replicated storage, I want to go ahead and add in the networking. So let's go inside of the remotes folder and we're going to add in a brand new remote event. I'm going to duplicate the current remote event that we already have, but you can add it in yourself, really doesn't matter. But what does matter is what we name this brand new remote event, and what I want to name it is skip. So how we're going to use this remote event is on the client side, whenever the player clicks that use button inside of our skips GUI, we're going to fire off this remote event, which will communicate to the server that, hey, I'm a player and I want to skip the current stage that I'm on. So the server will listen to that and it'll check if the player should be able to skip it. And if they should be able to because they do have skips, then it'll go ahead and skip the stage for them. So with all that being said, we're fully finished inside of the replicated storage, so we can collapse all of that. And now to really begin implementing this system, let's go ahead and first script this on the server side. So we're going to go inside of the server script service, inside of the services folder. And to make this a little bit easier on ourselves, we're going to go ahead and start off by duplicating the settings service. Of course, we'll go ahead and rename this to be called the skip service, and then we'll go ahead and open that up. Now, inside of here, we are going to need the replicated storage, but we're also going to need 2 other services as well. The first service that we're going to need is actually the player service. So we'll create a variable for that. And then we also want to create a variable for the server script service as well. Then we are going to need the player data service, but we're going to need a few more of our custom made services as well. So in addition to the player data service, we also want to create a variable for the progress service. And we also want to create a variable for the respawn service as well. So now that we've gotten our 3 custom services, we actually don't need to create a variable for the settings config, but instead we actually need to create a variable for the stages config. So let's go ahead and update that variable. And then our last one is the remotes variable, which we are going to keep as well. Then when it comes to the rest of this stuff, we can actually pretty much just go ahead and delete all of that. Then to start us off, we're going to go ahead and create a function, which is going to be a part of the local table. And this is going to be called skip loop, and it's not going to have any parameters. Now, this function is actually going to be called one single time, and it's going to be called as soon as our game starts up. And what we mean by skip loop is basically inside of this function, we're going to have an unlimitedly running while loop. Basically, this while loop is going to run every single second, and inside of the while loop, we want to iterate through all the players inside of our game. And we want to check what the current time is, and then compare it to when their next skip time is to determine if they should be rewarded with the skip or not. So, the first thing that we want to do inside of this function is say task.spawn. The The reason for that is because we are using an unlimited while loop, so we want to prevent our script from stalling when this function is called. So let's go ahead and create an anonymous function inside of the task.spawn, and then we'll go ahead and create our while loop. So we're going to say while true do, and then towards the bottom of our while loop, let's go ahead and say task.wait1, so this waits a second with each iteration. Then inside of the while loop, we actually want to use a pcall. So let's go ahead and say pcall, and then create an anonymous function inside of here. I believe I've gone over this previously, but the reason that we're using a pcall is because just in case any errors occur inside of the logic that we write here, this will actually prevent the while loop from stopping because an error has occurred. So basically, the pcall will absorb the error, and the while loop will be maintained and continue running and iterating as it normally does. Basically, we're using the pcall because we want to be extremely safe, as this while loop is only called when our game starts up for the first time, so a single time, and if this while loop were to ever break, then that means that all the players that are currently in the server will not receive any skips because the while loop has actually been broken, and we would want to avoid that at pretty much all costs. Anyways, now that we're inside of the pcall, what we want to do is we want to iterate through all of the players in our game. So we're going to use a for loop for that. We're going to say for_player in players, get players do. Then let's go ahead and access the player's data. So we're going to create a variable called state, and we're going to use the player data service and the get state function passing through the player. Now, of course, if we do not get the player state, then we want to continue end. So we continue iterating through the loop, and then we'll just go ahead and go to the next player. If we were to use return, then that would actually break this loop. Now that we know that we've gotten the player state, we want to create a variable for the next skip time. So we're going to call this next skip time, and we're going to set that equal to the state.skips.next. Then we'll create a variable for the current time, which is going to be equal to os.time. Then we're going to create a variable called is_before_next. And what we want to do is we want to check if the current time is still before the next skip time. So the player should not be rewarded with a skip yet because we still haven't approached that time. So what we would want to do is we would want to check if the next skip time is greater than the current time. And if that is true, so we'll say if is before next, then what we'll do is we'll say continue end and iterate through the next player. But now that we've gotten this far down, we know that the player has actually earned a skip. So let's go ahead and create our action. Of course, we'll set the type of this variable to be of the player data service.update action type, and it's going to be a table. So for the type of this action, it is going to be earn skip. And remember how we actually set up our earn skip action? We don't need to include any other information, so that's our entire action right there. Now that we've created that action, let's go ahead and use the player data service to actually update the player state. So we'll say update state, we'll pass through the player, and then we'll also pass through the action as well. And now we're actually rewarding the player with another skip after 2 minutes. Cool, so now we fully finished with actually creating this function. Let's go ahead and use it. Like I said, we're going to use this one single time, and that is when the game starts up. So let's go ahead and create our standard shared.onStart function. And inside of here, we're going to go ahead and call the skip loop function. Now, what's left for us to script inside of here is the functionality for a player actually using a skip and skipping the stage. But we actually have to make one small change to the progress service before we do that. So let's go back inside of our Explorer, back inside of the server script service, inside of the services folder, and open up the progress service module script. Now inside of here, we can see that we actually only have a single function. And I mean, if we look at the bulk of the function, or at least most of this logic right here, effectively, all we're really doing is making sure that the player can progress to the next stage and then updating their state to reflect that. So what we want to do is we want to extract this exact functionality right here, put it into a shared function, which will allow other scripts like, say, the skip service to also use that functionality as well. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and cut all of that code out. Then we're going to go ahead and create a shared function. This shared function is going to be called touch checkpoint, and it's going to have 2 parameters. The first parameter is going to be the player, and the second parameter is going to be the checkpoint, which is actually going to be a spawn location. Then let's go ahead and paste all of that code that we had previously. Now we can actually delete this stage variable right here, and we'll start off with the player state. I'm actually going to rename this variable from player state to just being called state. And then of course, if we don't get the state, then we want to return end and stop the function right there. Then we have a variable called player stage, which we need to update as well. So that would be state.stage. Now before the player stage variable, I'm going to create another variable, which is going to be called new stage. And to get the new stage, what we want to do is we want to get the parent of the checkpoint, and we want to get their name and convert that to a number. Now, the reason that we have a red underline here is because we cannot guarantee that the checkpoint will actually have a parent. So to fix this, we would say if checkpoint.parent then, and then wrap it in an if statement to do that. But I'm not going to do that just because I feel like it's completely unnecessary. Although for how much I hate these red underlines, it makes me kind of want to do it. But anyway, as long as we write all of our code as we should, we really should never have an error where the checkpoint doesn't exactly exist. But if you want to be on the safer end, of course, you could use an if statement here as well. Feel free to do whatever you want to. Anyways, now that we've created that variable, we need to go ahead and update our isNextStage variable. Currently, we use this variable to make sure that the checkpoint which is passed through to this function is actually the next stage of the player. So we take the stage that the player is currently on, we add 1 to it, and then we check if it is the stage of the next checkpoint. So we would change this from being equal to stage to being equal to new stage. Or actually, I was going to say it might be better to call this variable next stage, but to be fair, this actually doesn't guarantee that it is the next stage. What we're doing here is guaranteeing that this is the next stage though. So I'm fine with leaving this called new stage. Anyways, after that, if it is not the next stage, then we stop the function right there. And then finally, after that, we have the action right here, and then we actually update the player's data. Now, there's 2 more things that I actually want to do inside of here. The first thing is we actually want to set the respawn location property of the player to the brand new checkpoint that was passed to this function. Now, to be completely honest, I'm not 100% sure if this is required. When I created this obby, I did include this in here, but this could be old code, which I actually forgot to remove once I implemented the respawn controller on the client side. Now, with that being said, that might make me look a little bit silly. But the thing is that this doesn't cause any negative effects. It doesn't have any harmful or negative side effects. And when I'm thinking about this, realistically, this is kind of just an extra safety measure. And that has to do with the streaming enabled property. So depending on how you have your obby set up, imagine you have streaming enabled set up and the player is trying to skip to another stage, which they don't actually currently have loaded into their game. Now, even though that's possible, because of how we actually set up the respawn service and the respawn controller, we should be already accounting for that. But just in case those 2 systems fail, and let's just say that the player is not instantly teleported over to that stage, what we did is we actually set the respawn location to this checkpoint. So theoretically, this is like another safety valve, which just in case those other safety measures failed, the player might just be stuck. But if they actually reset or die and they actually respawn, they should be teleported to the new respawn location because we did update that property of the player. Again, though, like I said, not 100% sure if this is required. It doesn't do anything negative, so I wouldn't worry about it. I would just include it just in case we do actually need it. And like I said, there is one more thing that we want to do in this function, and the last thing that we want to actually do here is actually return true. And rather than explaining why we're returning true at the end of this function right now, we'll do that once we actually use this in the skip service. Anyways, now that we've created this function, let's go back inside of the setup spawn location function and make sure that we actually use that inside of here. So back inside of here, we're going to say shared.touch checkpoint. Then we'll go ahead and pass through the player, and then we'll also pass through the descendant as the checkpoint as well. And now that's all that we're going to do inside of the progress service module script. So we can go ahead and close out of this and return back to the skip service. Cool, so now that we're back inside of the skip service, let's go ahead and scroll down below the skip loop function. We'll go ahead and create another function, which is again going to be a part of the local table. And we'll go ahead and call this skip stage. And the only parameter this function is going to have is the player. Now, like I said, this function is going to be used when the player is requesting to actually skip a stage. So the first thing we want to do inside of here is go ahead and actually get the player state. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called state. Then we'll go ahead and use the player data service .get state, pass it to the player to get the player state. Of course, if we do not get the state, then we'll go ahead and say return end to stop the function right there. Now that we've gotten the player state, the first thing that we want to do is make sure that they actually have some skips. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called hasSkips. And to check if the player has skips or not, we'll go ahead and go inside of their state, inside of the skips table, and then we'll check if the amount is greater than 0. Now, if the player does not have any skips, then all we want to do is go ahead and return end, stop the function right there. Now that we know that the player does have some skips, the next thing that we want to do is make sure that they are not at the max stage. So we're going to create a variable called current stage, which is going to be equal to state.stage. Then we want to create a variable for the max stage. How do we get the max stage? Well, we can use the stages config, and we can get the get total stages function that we created before. And now we'll create a variable called is@max_stage. And we'll use this variable to determine if the player is at the max stage or not. So how can we determine if the player is at the max stage? Well, what we would do is we would compare the current stage and see if that is greater than or equal to the max stage. And now, if the player is at the max stage, then we want to go ahead and return end, stop the function right there. Now that we know that the player is not at the max stage, what we then want to do is create a variable for the next stage. So we're going to go ahead and say next stage equals, and to get the next stage, what we would do is we would take their current stage and just add 1 to it. Then we want to go ahead and create a variable for the spawn location of that specific stage. And we can actually get this by, again, using the stages config and using the get spawn location function. Then we'll go ahead and pass through the next stage number. And if for some reason we do not get that spawn location, then we want to go ahead and return and stop the function right there. Now that we've actually gotten that spawn location, let's go ahead and try to skip the stage for that player. So we're actually going to create a variable called didSkipStage. And now to actually get the player to skip the stage, we want to use the progress service, and we want to use the function that we just created, which is called touchCheckpoint. With this function, we need to go ahead and pass through the player, and then we also need to pass through the spawn location as well. Now, the reason that we're setting that equal to a variable is because at the end of that variable, we return true once we've successfully updated the player's checkpoint. So before we reduce the amount of skips that the player currently has because they've just used one, we want to make sure that there was no errors that we didn't think of, and they actually did skip over to the next stage. So we want to say if not did skip stage then, and now if the player did not skip the stage, then we want to return and stop the function right there as well. But now that we're this far down, we do know that the player did actually skip the stage, so we can go ahead and create our action. So we're going to go ahead and create our action, which is of course going to be of the player data service dot update state action type. It's going to be equal to a table. And for the type of our action, it is of course going to be use skip, and we don't need to include any other information inside of that table. Now that we've created that action, let's go ahead and use the player data service to update the player state by passing through the player and passing through that action. Now, there's one more thing that we need to do, and that is actually teleporting the player to the brand new stage because they've just skipped the current one. And remember, the touchCheckpoint doesn't actually do this. The touchCheckpoint just actually handles the logic for updating the player's stage of their state whenever they actually advance and touch the checkpoint for doing that. And then right here, we just update their state for using a skip. So now we actually need to teleport the player to the brand new stage because they've just skipped their current one. And to do this, all we have to do is use the respawn service and use the respawn player function, which makes it extremely simple. So all we have to do is pass through the player, and then that'll be all good to go. Now we will also handle this portion of it on the client side, but we want to use this just in case streaming is enabled and the next stage that the player is skipping to is out of their streaming distance. So in case we're unable to handle it on the client side, it will be handled on the server side, and it should all be good to go. And with that being said, that's actually all that we have to do with this function. So let's go ahead and use it. We'll go back towards the top of our script, inside of our onStart function, and when did I say that we were going to use this? Well, like I said, we're going to use this whenever the player actually uses a skip. And we can know when the player wants to use a skip by listening to that skip remote event that we created earlier. So we're going to say remotes.skip.onServerEvent, connect, create an anonymous function, which is going to include a player. And actually, I'll specify the type of the player just like that. And then we can go ahead and call local.skipStage and pass through the player just like that. Actually, now that I think about it, we can make this a little bit shorter. You can leave it as is. This is perfectly fine. But alternatively, what we could also do is just call the function directly like this as well. And this works perfectly fine as well. The player will automatically be passed to skip stage when that function is called. Using either way is perfectly fine. They do the exact same thing, but this one is just one line while the other one is 3 lines. Honestly, I would probably recommend that more people use this because at least when you use this, you can easily add print statements inside of here if you need to debug this for some reason. But of course, when you use it this way, you would still have to create that anonymous function to even really be able to do any debugging. But either way, you can choose whichever method you want to go with. Either way works perfectly fine. Anyways, with that being said, we're all good with this, so we can go ahead and close out of this script. And now we're actually fully finished with implementing this on the server side, so we can go ahead and collapse the services and the server script service. And now it's time to begin implementing this on the client side. So we're going to go inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, inside of the controllers folder, and the first thing that we want to do is actually add our brand new GUI to the GUI controller. So let's go ahead and open up that module script. And inside of here, we want to go to the GUI's variable, and underneath where we add settings to here, we also want to add skips to here as well. So we'll go ahead and say player GUI, wait for child, and then we want to wait for skips. Cool. Now we're done with inside of the GUI controller, so we can go ahead and close out of that. Next, we want to go inside of the GUI's folder, inside of the top folder, and now we're going to go ahead and start scripting the skip button. Well, actually the entire skip GUI as well. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and duplicate the stage module script that's already inside of here, and we're going to rename this to be called skips. Then we'll go ahead and open it up. And now, inside of here, we are not going to need the player service, so we can go ahead and remove that. We also don't need the player variable, so we can remove that. We are going to need the UI controller and the state controller, though, but we're not going to need the stages config, so we can go ahead and remove that. Instead of the stages config, though, we are going to want to create a variable for the remotes inside of the replicated storage, just like that. Then we'll come back to these top variables right here, but what I first want to do is go ahead and pretty much just clear out all of those functions, just like that. Okay, so I'm actually going to start off by deleting that constant, and now let's go ahead and start with the GUI variable. For the GUI variable, we don't want to set this to the top GUI. Instead, we want to set this to the skips GUI. Then let's actually just delete the progress bar variable for now. We're actually going to make another variable called progress bar though. But anyway, we'll go ahead and first start off with the frame. So we're going to say GUI.frame. Then we want to create a variable for the progress bar. So let's go ahead and do that. And we'll set that to the frame.progress bar. We also want to create a variable for the use button. So that's inside of the frame as well. And that is called use. Then we also want to create a variable for the exit button, which is again inside of the frame, and it is called exit. Now we want to make one more variable here, which is going to be called open button. And that's not actually inside of the GUI that we're currently using. Instead, we want to use the GUI controller inside of the GUI's variable, and then we get access to the top screen GUI. Then we want to go inside of that frame, and inside of that frame, we should have a text button called skip. So that is actually our open button. Now that we've found all those variables, we're going to go ahead and create our first constant. This constant is going to be called useButton_text, and it's going to be set to a string. And this string is basically going to be a template of the text, which is displayed on the use button. And what we want this to actually say is use, and then opening parenthesis, then in all capital letters, we'll write out the word replace, and then add a closing parenthesis. Of course, we're using this because we're actually going to replace the word replace inside of here with the amount of skips that the player currently has. So that could be 0, that could be 999, or however many skips they actually have at that time. Anyways, we also want to create one more variable inside of here, which is going to be called skip cooldown, and this is actually the amount of seconds between each skip. So we're going to set this to 120. Okay, cool. Now that we've created all those variables, let's go ahead and start off with creating our shared.onStart function. The first thing that we want to do inside of here is let's go ahead and actually set up the open button for displaying the GUI. So we're going to say open button.mousebutton1click, connect, create an anonymous function inside of here, and then we just have to say GUI.enabled equals not GUI.enabled. So whenever the open button is clicked, the GUI will be either displayed or hidden based on if it is currently displayed or not. We'll also go ahead and blur the background as well by using the GUI controller and calling toggle blur effect, and then we'll go ahead and pass through GUI enabled just like that. Now that we've set up the open button, let's also go ahead and set up the exit buttons. So we'll say exit button.mousebutton1click, connect, create an anonymous function. And then this time we'll say GUI.enabled equals false. And then of course we want to also disable the blur effect. So we'll go ahead and say GUI controller.toggle blur effect, and we'll pass through false just like that. Cool. So now we scripted opening and closing the GUI. The next thing we want to do is go ahead and create another function. This is going to be part of the local table. And this function is going to be called update use button. And now what we want to do with this function is we want to update the text of the use button to display the amount of skips that the player actually has. So inside of here, let's go ahead and create a variable called skips, which is going to be the amount of skips that the player currently has. And we can get that by saying stateController.getState.skips.amount. And now let's go ahead and update the use button. So we'll go ahead and say use button, and we don't actually want to update the text of this. Instead, we want to go ahead and get the title text label inside of there, and we want to update the text of that. And now what are we going to set the text of this to? Well, we're going to use our use button text constant that we created earlier. Then we're going to use the gsub method on it, and then we want to replace the word replace with the amount of skips that the player actually has. And that's actually all that we're going to do inside of this function. It's a very small and simple function. Anyways, let's go back to our onStart function, and let's consider when we would actually want to update the use button. There's a couple of different times when we would want to update the use button, but the ones that instantly come to my mind is either when the player earns a skip or when the player uses a skip. And to track both of those things, we can actually go ahead and use the state controller. And we'll actually use that update state bindable event as well. So we'll go ahead and say .update state.event connect, create an anonymous function inside of here. Of course, the first thing that's passed to this is actually the action. So we can go ahead and say state controller.update state action. And I'm not even going to include the state because we're not going to use it inside of here. But anyway, inside of here, we want to check if the action type is either earn skip or use skip. So let's actually create a variable for that. The first variable is going to be called isEarnSkip. And what are we going to set that to? Well, we would set that to the action.type equaling earnSkip. Then we'll do the same thing for useSkip. So we'll say isUseSkip, and then to set that, the action type would be equal to useSkip. So now that we're determining if it is either earnSkip or useSkip, let's actually go ahead and use an if statement for that. So we're going to say if isEarnSkip or isUseSkip, then. And then what we would want to do, if it's either of these two, is we would want to go ahead and update the use button. So we'll go ahead and call that function right there. So anytime the player uses or earns a skip, we're going to go ahead and update that use button just as we should. Next, what we can do is actually go ahead and script the use button for when it's clicked on. So we're going to say useButton.mouseButton1click, connect, create an anonymous function inside of here. And now what do we want to do when this button is clicked? Well, it's very simple. All we want to do is actually fire off that skip remote event to the server. So we can go ahead and say fire server just like that. Next, what we want to do is we want to create another function, which is again going to be a part of the local table, and this is going to be called update progress. Now, this function is going to be pretty similar to the one that we created on the server side inside of the skip service, where we actually use an infinite while loop to continuously reward all the players with skips who actually deserve it. So the first thing we want to do inside of this function is say task.spawn and create an anonymous function inside of here. Then inside of this task.spawn, we're going to go ahead and create a while loop. Now, actually, I was a little bit wrong about this being an infinite while loop. My mistake. We actually only want this while loop to run while the GUI is enabled. So we're going to say while GUI.enabled do. And the reason for that is because we only really care about updating the progress when the GUI is being displayed to the player. If it's not being displayed to the player, then there is no point in updating the progress because the player can't even see it. So why would we use the processing power to handle that stuff? Anyways, now that we're inside of this while loop, we're going to want this to run every single second. So we're going to say task.wait 1, and then just to be precautious and safe, we're going to go ahead and use a p-call and then wrap most of the logic inside of this p-call. So inside of this p-call is where we're going to write the logic for calculating the progress and then actually updating the progress bar. And remember, the progress is referring to how much more time the player has to wait until they receive their next skip. So the first thing that we're going to want to do inside of this function is create a variable called next skip. And what this refers to is the time of when the player will receive their next skip. So we'll go ahead and use the state controller .get state. Then we'll go inside of the skips table, and then we'll use the next variable. Then we want to create a variable for the current time, which is simply just equal to os.time. Then we want to calculate the amount of seconds that the player has left before they earn their next skip. And we can do that by subtracting the current time from the next skip time. Now, we want to do something a little bit more than just doing the subtraction right here. What we want to do is we want to use the math library and we want to use the max function. Math.max returns the maximum value among the numbers passed to this function. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass the number 0 and then we're going to pass next skip minus current time. The reason that we're using math.max here and we're passing through 0 is because this ensures that the seconds left variable is never going to be a negative number. The only time that we should ever see this possibly being negative is when the player logs in after not logging in for a long time. The reason for that is because the next skip would be set to an old time because the player hasn't joined since those 2 minutes that it was set to. And so then the current time would be significantly further ahead than the next skip. But realistically, that should only be possible to be seeing the negative number for like 1 second, maybe even less than that. Realistically, the player should never actually see the negative number, but we're still using math.max here just in case and to fully prevent that from ever possibly happening. Now that we've determined the amount of seconds that are left, the next thing that we want to do is create a variable for the amount of progress that has been made. And then to determine this, inside of parentheses, what we want to do is we want to use the skip cooldown variable and then subtract the amount of seconds that are left from that. And then we want to go ahead and divide that amount by skip cooldown to calculate the progress as a fraction of the time that has elapsed. So now we've actually gotten the amount of progress, and now the next thing that we're going to do is we're basically going to convert the amount of seconds left into a nicely displayed string, which displays the amount of minutes and seconds left before the player earns another skip. So we're going to create a variable called minutes. And to determine the amount of minutes that are left, we're going to use math.floor, and then we're going to pass through seconds left and divide that by 60. Then we're going to create a variable called seconds, and then we'll say seconds left, and we'll use a percent symbol, and then we'll say 60. What this percent symbol does is it effectively checks how many times 60 can go into seconds left. No, I'm not gonna lie. If you guys have watched my videos for a little while, you know I am terrible with math. So I wanted to have ChatGPT explain this to you guys. Unfortunately, in my opinion, this explanation isn't even really that simple. But basically, the percent symbol is used for modulo operation. In very simple terms, the modulo operation gives you the remainder of a division between two numbers. For example, if you divide 5 by 2, the remainder is 1. So 5 with the percent symbol 2 in Lua would result in 1. It's a way to figure out what's left over after dividing one number by another. So to make this a little bit more easier to understand, if we have 120, which would be the maximum amount of seconds left on the left side of the percent symbol, and then we have 60 on the right-hand side, we get 0. But then if we reduce 120 down to, say, 119, we're now left with 59 seconds. And then if we go down to 118, we then get 58, 117, 57. But then if we get all the way down to 60, we get 0 once again. If we go to 61, then we get 1 because we would have 1 second left, for example. And then again, if we go to 60, we get 0, but then if we go to 59, we get 59. And then if we go to 58, of course, we get 58, and we would get that going all the way down to 1 and 0, for example. So now it should be a little bit easier to understand the seconds variable, because basically seconds is going to be a number between hopefully 0 and 59, as that is the amount of possible seconds that could be left. Then we're going to go ahead and create a variable called time formatted. And this is actually going to be a string which displays the time in a minute and seconds format. Now keep in mind that I actually did use AI to generate the solution, so I can't thoroughly explain it to you. And you might be thinking, well, Monster, why don't you just have the AI explain it to us? In my opinion, kind of like this percent symbol right here, or this like form of math, these are one of those things that you're only ever going to use one time, maybe once or twice a year. And I feel like it's just not going to stick in your head. And it's not really worth me teaching this to you because you're just not going to use it enough for it to actually stick inside of your brain. Maybe I'm wrong, and I wouldn't argue against you if you said differently, but that's just how I feel. So if you want to get an explanation of this, you could either look it up, you could ask ChatGPT to explain it to you, or do whatever you want. It's really not that big of a deal. Anyways, we're going to say string.format. Then for the format string, what we're going to pass through is a percent symbol, then the number 0, then the number 2, and then a D. Then we'll use a colon, then we'll use another percent symbol, another 0, another 2, and then we'll pass through a D once again. And then we're going to go ahead and pass through 2 arguments to this function, which first we'll go ahead and pass through minutes, and then we'll go ahead and pass through seconds. And then that'll give us a string that'll look something like this, for example. So 00, or maybe even like 0259, like that. So that's the type of string that this is going to return for us. And now that we've actually gotten that string, let's go ahead and update the progress bar. Now remember, inside of our GUI controller, we actually made a function for easily handling the progress bar. So we'll go ahead and use the GUI controller, and then we'll actually use the handle progress bar function. We need to go ahead and pass through the progress bar, as well as the progress made, and finally the time formatted string. And now this will automatically handle updating the progress bar for us. And that's actually all that we're going to do with the update progress function, so we can go ahead and use this. And now, when do we want to actually use this? Well, beneath where we set up our use button, what we actually want to do is we want to listen for our screen GUI to be enabled or not enabled. So we'll actually use a method on it called getPropertyChangedSignal. And this method actually accepts the specific property as a string that we want to listen for when it's changed. And we want to actually listen to the enabled property being changed. Then we can simply go ahead and connect to it. And now if the GUI is enabled, then what we want to do is we actually want to go ahead and call the update progress function. So we'll go ahead and say local.updateProgress, just like that. So now anytime the player opens up the GUI, we'll go ahead and activate updating the progress bar. Now, there's actually one more thing that I almost forgot to do inside of here, and that is with the use button. Of course, we want to update the use button anytime the player earns a skip or uses a skip, but we also want to update the use button when the script starts up for the first time. And we do that to kind of set the player's initial state, for example. So we'll go ahead and say local.updateUseButton, just like that, so that the button is updated with the current amount of skips that the player has, just in case they open up the GUI before one of these update states has actually been used. Now, we're almost fully finished with implementing this, but one more thing that we need to account for is actually that notification frame that we added inside of the open button. So let's think, when would we want to display that notification frame to the player? Well, we would want to display it anytime the player has actually earned some skips. So we can do that inside of where we listen to the update state event. Inside of here, we already check if the action is either earned or use skip. So below our current if statement, we can go ahead and make another if statement called isEarnedSkip. And if the player did earn a skip, then let's go ahead and display that notification to them. So we'll go ahead and say openButton.notification.visible equals true. So now that we're actually displaying the notification to them, we also need to hide the notification as well. And when would we want to do that? Well, we would actually want to do that whenever the player opens up the GUI. So we can go down here where we actually just checked if the enabled property of the GUI changes. So if the GUI does become enabled, then let's go ahead and hide that notification. So we'll say openButton.notification.visible equals false, just like that. And now, with that being said, we've pretty much implemented everything inside of here that we wanted to. Although I might organize this just a tiny bit differently. So I'm kind of organizing this by grouping all of the button clicks together. Then at the very bottom, I'll go ahead and add in where we listen to the update state event. Then I'll have our function calls at the very beginning. And then I'll also have this event where we listen to towards the end a little bit as well. So I just changed our organization inside of the onStart function a tiny bit. Anyways, with all that being said, let's go ahead and close out of the script and we can go into our game and begin testing this out. So let's go ahead and do that. Oh my gosh, somehow I've used onClient event inside of the skip service, which is very annoying because I'm pretty sure that I literally said .onServer event, but somehow I just didn't even look at it and I used onClient event. Anyway, now I actually almost forgot there is one more thing that we need to do before we do test this out, and that is updating the respawn controller. Luckily, we only need to make one slight update to this, and that is inside of the onStart function and when we listen for the state to be updated. Inside of here, what we want to do is we want to check if the action type is actually use skip. And if it is, then we want to go ahead and teleport the player to their new stage. So we can actually add in an else if statement here, and we're going to check if the type of the action is actually use skip. And if it is, all we're going to do is use the respawn player function, passing through the player's character, so player.character, and then for is death, we would pass through false because it should not count as a death. Now I'm recording this part after we fully finished creating this video, and that's because the amazing testers who test out these episodes before they actually come out gave me a few ideas on where we can improve the system at. Big shout out to Ash for actually thinking about this. One of the things they pointed out to me was that when you load into the game, even if you haven't received another skip, the notification will appear on the skip button by default whenever you join the game. And another thing they suggested is that while you have the skips GUI open, the notification will appear on the skip button as well. Now, for the most part, these are some pretty minor things, but we're going to go ahead and make about 2 tiny changes to actually fix this. So going back inside of the skips GUI script, and then we're going to go inside of the onStart function. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we can handle solving both of these issues. The first issue that we're going to solve is displaying the notification even if the player already has the GUI enabled. So inside of the onStart function, we'll actually go inside of where we listen to the update state event. And inside of here, we can see that anytime a player earns a skip, that's when we actually display the notification. Now, what we're going to do is above that if statement, we're going to create a variable, which is going to be called isGUI_enabled. And what we're going to do is we're going to check if the enabled property of the GUI is set to true. So then we'll go down to this if statement and we're going to say if isEarnSkip and not isGUI_enabled, then display the notification. So now we'll only display the notification when the skips GUI is not enabled and the player is not already looking at their skips. And now when it comes to hiding the notification when the player joins the game for the first time, there's a few different ways that you can handle this as well. One way of handling this that I've actually considered is by literally just setting the notification to not be visible when the player joins the game for the first time. Because my idea behind this is, do we really want to display the notification when the player initially joins the game? I could see some people not wanting to display the notification then and only displaying it after they've received another skip. Now, an alternative solution that one of my testers showed is they made the notification only visible if the player actually had some skips. And I can see that being a working solution as well. So I'll go ahead and show you that one as well. So I'm going to create a variable called hasSkips. And to determine if the player has skips, we would use their state. We would go inside of the skips table and then get the amount variable. And then we would check if that amount is greater than 0. So now that we've created that variable, we can then go ahead and set the visibility to if they have skips or not. So if the player does have skips, when they initially join the game, then the notification frame will be visible. Otherwise, if they don't have any skips, it will not be visible upon joining. So shout out to our tester Bobby for that solution. But like I said, there's many different ways that you can handle this, so feel free to choose whatever method you want to go with. And now that we've done that, we can go ahead and start up our game and test this out. So now, once we get into our game, we can see that I have a notification icon being displayed right there. Let's go ahead and open that up. And when I open that up, we can see that it says I have 1 skip right here. We can also see that the progress bar is increasing as the time is decreasing, so the progress bar is looking all good. Let's see if I can hit the exit button, and the GUI does exit, so that's looking good. If I click the skip button multiple times, we can see it displays it and hides the GUI. So that's all looking good. Let's go ahead and actually test out using a skip, so let's click the use button, and when we click the use button, we can see that I have been teleported directly to the next stage. So it does seem like skipping is actually working correctly as well. The next thing that I'll do is actually wait for us to earn a skip and see if the notification appears on this button as well. So after waiting a short time, I can actually see that the notification has appeared here. If I click on it, we can see that it does go away, and we can now see that I do have another skip to use, and the timer is continuing to count down. Once I use that, we can see that I have skipped to the next stage, so that does all seem to be working correctly. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with all that being said, that's going to be it for this video. As always, if you did enjoy, make sure you smash the like button, and if it did work for you, I'd really appreciate it if you left a comment down below that let other people know that it did work for you as well. As always, if you want to get access to all the scripts or the game file that we made during this episode, as well as a ton of other assets that you can use to create your own Roblox game, you can go down below in the description and visit either my Patreon or my website, monster.dev, where you can get access to all those things that I've just said and support me as well. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope that you have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.